Welcome to the Non-Obvious Insights Show. I'm your host, Rohit Bhargava, and every week I go through hundreds of news sources to curate the most interesting and underappreciated stories that you might have missed. This week, we'll be talking about the upside of transparent toilets, time crystals, a database with hundreds of years of recipes, a data analysis on how women vote, Fortnite's battle with Apple, and how the airports of the future might be very different than we imagined them 6 years ago. All that and my latest pick for the non-obvious book release of the week are coming in just a few seconds. We are live streaming to Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope, and the show starts right now. Happy Thursday, Non-Obvious Nation. I am back in my usual space, and I got to say, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot this week is how I've been working and how I work in different places. A lot of us have cabin fever right now, I think, and part of it is because like we're stuck in the same working space every single day, and I'm pretty lucky. I have a nice space. I have my nice office and everything like that. But one of the stories that really got me thinking about maybe shifting that up a little bit was a story this week about BlackBerry and the news that BlackBerry was going to be releasing a new phone. And yes, by the way, if you're a little bit surprised that BlackBerry's still around, yes, they are. And I used to be a big BlackBerry guy. I used to love my BlackBerry back in the day. And even when I was considering switching to iPhone back then, and then I got off of iPhone and onto Android devices and Samsung devices, I was a big BlackBerry guy because I love those keyboards. And yes, I know that makes me sound old. Totally get it. But the keyboard is awesome. And the thing is, maybe I just have like fat fingers. I don't know, but like I can type much faster on that keyboard. And so the fact that BlackBerry's coming out with a new one, it got me thinking like I'm traveling less right now. And as a part of that, I'm taking a lot fewer photos on my phone. And so the camera, which used to be like the killer app for me on the phone, I just wanted the best possible camera I could get, is a little bit less important to me. And also, I don't play a lot of games on my phone. I generally scroll through news stories, but I do a lot of work now on my phone. And I'm just thinking, like, if I had a phone with a full keyboard, I could probably get like a lot more work done, just like being outside or being like anywhere except for right here. And I wonder if there are more people who are thinking in that way. And maybe that'll lead to a resurgence of BlackBerry, and that would be kind of cool. So anyway, the BlackBerry is kind of hard to get right now in the US. It doesn't seem as well set up for that, but it got me this week. I was just kind of dreaming about having a phone with a keyboard again. that was my first thought from this, and I thought I'd share that with you just as the kind of initial story here. Another one that is pretty curious on the surface, it was a story about the Nippon Foundation commissioning 16 different artists to create new public restrooms, or at least like a new vision for a public restroom. And one of them was a transparent toilet. So a toilet where you could literally see through the walls. And on first glance, you might think like this is pretty much a creation that weirdos would come up with for other weirdos to use. But the reason why this actually worked, and by the way, when you lock the doors, the walls turn opaque. So it's not like you're publicly peeing or anything like that. So it's not that weird. But one of the things that they discovered, which I thought was an interesting insight around why people don't like public restrooms. And on the surface, if I said, why don't you like to use a public restroom, especially now with like the pandemic and coronavirus and all that, the reasons are pretty obvious, right? It's unclean. Usually they are just like kind of nasty situations, especially because guys use them, and so like they probably get worse because of that, right? Female bathrooms, or if they're separated, I imagine them to be cleaner. You guys have like couches and all sorts of like bowls of cash and stuff in there that we don't have. But this is for anybody, these public restrooms. But the reason why the transparent restroom was such an interesting idea was because of two things that people really hate about public restrooms. One is that you don't know if somebody's inside. And so you're always faced with that potentially creepy moment of like opening the door to like find somebody there, even though it looked like it was empty, which is really like something you want to avoid. And the other is that you don't know if it's a disaster in there. And so at least if it's transparent, you can kind of look inside ahead of committing yourself to going in there, and maybe you might be more likely to use it. And so this experiment kind of brought to life one of the most interesting things I find about any sort of social experiment or any sort of creativity experiment, which is that when you can imagine the barriers that someone has and you can understand what they are to something, to anything, you can come up with a creative design for something that might solve those. And that was what was most interesting about this commissioned piece of work to me. I was also reading this week about the Small Agency Awards from Ad Age magazine. And the small agency that won the Agency of the Year award was an agency called High Dive. And they were the ones that were responsible for a couple of the, I know it seems like a really long time ago, but a couple of the most popular Super Bowl ads from this last year's Super Bowl. So the ad where Bill Murray was reprising his role as Phil the weatherman from the movie Groundhog Day, because the Super Bowl happened to be on Groundhog Day this year. Man, that seems like a really long time ago, doesn't it? But there was another ad that topped the charts where Jason Momoa, the guy who played Aquaman in the film, was portrayed as kind of having faked his physique and hair, and he kind of takes off his fake hairpiece, and all of these sorts of things. And that was the agency behind it. And when they did an interview with one of the managing directors from the agency, he said something that I found so interesting, having been like a former agency guy myself. He talked about how important it was for them, as a secret of their success, a so-called secret of their success, to basically, when they got all these accolades, essentially turn down all media requests and refer them to the client and make their clients look better, amazing. And it just reminded me that sometimes this power of creativity, and the most creative people, the thing you don't often get alongside that is humility and a humble creativity. But if you did, maybe that would power your success. And I've been thinking a bunch about this lately, only because I've been lucky. I mean, I spend a lot of my life and the things that I talk about being the guy on stage or on virtual stage now, right? And people, in many cases, they're paying to hear some of the things that I want to share. And so you get used to being the person out in front. And to some degree, like, your success is based on being able to be that guy. And then I've got this publishing company that I've been working on with my wife Chavi, and we've got all these authors. And at the end of the day, like, it's not our book, it's their book, and we get to be behind the scenes. And it just reminded me that sometimes the most value and, like, the most fulfilling thing comes from, like, not being the guy, but like being behind the scenes, powering that and moving forward, and letting someone else kind of be in the front. And I think that part of the reason maybe why I like that so much is because I don't have it all the time. I think that if I was always behind the scenes and never really out in front, it might bother me that I never really get to be the front person. But when I have enough chances to be out in front, it's really nice to kind of be behind the scenes and just, like, power somebody else to be awesome. And I think that we all kind of need a balance of that. Otherwise, we become either resentful because we never get the credit, or we never get appreciated, or we just develop this huge ego and we become like humongous assholes because, like, we're always the person. And neither one is, I think, is like the best way to go. I think that we need, like, a balance of both of those. So anyway, that's what I thought about there. There was another story this week that reminded me of something that I remember writing about and talking about. Man, it must have been like 5 or 6 years ago that I was writing and talking about a story of a team of Stanford scientists who created a VR experiment, a virtual reality experiment, where they allowed people to be the cow in a simulation that would have the cow being led to slaughter. And so you could be the cow in that situation. Then they asked people, like, how did you feel about that? And most people, what they said is, I felt sad. Like, I felt like I was marching towards the end. And it was this different way of feeling empathy in a much deeper way for animals, in this case, for cows. And this story that came out just this past week reminded me of that, because there was a team called Direct Action Everywhere. That's sort of a pretty militant activist group that takes huge risks. There was a story several months ago about how they risk prison to sneak into places to film what's really happening. And in thinking about it and writing about this, I was writing about their VR experience of going behind the scenes into a factory farm for pigs and just showing what that's really like. And contrasting that with a VR experience that came out last year, which I also linked to in my email newsletter this week, where the National Pork Board did the same thing, but obviously with a very different take to try and show transparency. And it just reminded me that so many times we see different versions of the same experience. You've got one VR experience put out by the group that promotes farmers who are working with pigs, and then you've got another one by a group that snuck in and did this kind of secret footage. And obviously they have very opposite polarizing viewpoints. Along with this story, I read another story this week about a sustainable farming group for salmon that contracted with a third-party software company to basically create complete transparency around how they farm the salmon, start to finish. And you can essentially scan the barcode and you can see like the whole sequence from start to finish. And that's kind of the future of this, because more and more what we're seeing is like we don't believe the PR version of what is being put out by an industry saying, hey, everything's good, we're all, we're treating everything perfectly and it's all clean and everything's ethical. We also kind of see the activist side, and that seems a little extreme also, and maybe not always the case either, because not everybody doing these things must be bad. And so we need something in between, and we need some way of managing that transparency so that we actually believe it. And that's what I thought was interesting about the combination of this VR versus some of these tools that allow us to have that transparency, which is they go across the board and they let us see both things. This week, the big news, one of the biggest pieces of news, was about Fortnite and others fighting back against what they call the Apple tax, which is the 30% fee that Apple charges for anything that's downloaded through their platform. And so it wasn't, Fortnite made the biggest news, but it wasn't just Fortnite. What was interesting is Apple created a new update to their iOS system that caused people who would click on stories to go to the Apple News Plus tool to read those stories instead of to the publisher's site. And that's a paid service. So now we're cannibalizing revenue from the publishers, paid subscribers. And then Facebook was criticizing Apple because they were refused to reduce their fee for a tool that Facebook created to help small businesses during a pandemic. And so all of these attacks are coming from all of these different sides, and they're basically about the same thing, which is we think you're greedy. We think that you're taking too much and that you are using your monopoly of the App Store, and we don't like it. And this, to some degree, I think is predictable about Apple. I think it's something that's led many people, myself included, to move off of Apple products because of the closed ecosystem and because of our belief that like that way of thinking and that way of doing business that says, look, we control everything. And if you want into this ecosystem, like you're going to pay for it, or we're just not going to let you into it because it's a closed system. It's not as sustainable for the future, I don't think, and many other people don't think, as something that is more open, that's more open source, that's more open platform. And you can criticize a lot of different platforms for this sort of behavior. But what was interesting was all of this was coming at the same time, and also that it was Fortnite, because Fortnite is a mega platform at this point. They have more than 300 million users, and they created their own in-app payment gateway. And they literally showed, you can see in the image, they said, look, buy this thing with Apple and it'll cost you this much, and buy it directly with us and it'll cost you this much. And they very visibly showed the Apple tax. And that is a pretty powerful move to make, and one that lots of people in the industry are watching, because Fortnite actually has the clout to be able to do this. And not only do they have the clout, but they've also filed a lawsuit. They had this brilliant mock video where they took Apple's famous 1984 ad and remade it where they were the sort of victims and of kind of the monopoly. So they switched it around, and that was really interesting because it is going to be a fight that many people in the tech industry are going to be watching. and one that I think was a long time coming. And so I'll be watching this. I definitely recommend you keep tracking that as well. I read this week also about time crystals, and I saw this headline and I was like immediately drawn to the story because apparently scientists have discovered that something that they thought was present, these so-called time crystals, which is the way that atoms move and have a sequence, not just in terms of shape, but also in terms of the time and how they organize themselves over time. I was so intrigued because I thought, oh man, now time crystals, like that's a fundamental piece of like so many different sci-fi shows and storylines. But it turns out that like the way that they want to use time crystals, at least what the article talked about, was like they could totally transform how we use atomic clocks. And I was like, oh, man, that's so boring. So boring. But what was interesting to me about that is like this seemed like one of those announcements where we don't exactly know how significant it is right now, but it is cool that we discovered it. And probably later on, at some point in the future, we'll discover like something really amazing that comes from these. And the story itself just reminded me that there are so many of these things that we see on a daily basis where like they seem significant, but we don't exactly know why they're significant. And in a news climate and a media climate where it's so much about like, hey, this thing's happening today and that's the big news for today, we forget about some of these long-term things that may have an impact 10, 20, 50 years from now. And it seemed like this particular discovery in this field of research is one of those things. I don't know why. I don't have a scientific background to believe that or think that, but history has shown in many, many cases that like we don't appreciate the significance of that thing in the moment when it's uncovered. But over time, we realize that. And this seemed like one of those things. So at the very least, now that you've heard that story, you can say, man, I heard it here. Like I saw it here first. And that's something, right? That's what I try and do every week. I try and share the most interesting stories of the week. And for many of you, you know that means that I publish an email newsletter. And the email newsletter comes out every Thursday morning. So you may have already received it if you're on the list. And if you're not, I highly encourage you to subscribe. You can go to this link and check it out. And the stories that I just talked about, those stories are part of that process and that email. Another story that was not included in the email, and you get some bonuses when you listen to this show, was my non-obvious double take story of the week. And this is a story that made me think twice. And it was about the life's work of a author who essentially at one point was a neighbor of Julia Child and had access to her personal library of recipe books, and essentially made it her life's mission to collect all of these recipe books and catalog them in a really inventive sort of card catalog system of her own before computers were around to help her organize it. And then when computers did come around, she started kind of layering the database on top of it. And now there's a Wikipedia style resource where you can go and check out recipe books and cookbooks from the last several hundred years. So imagine you could go, and one of the examples the articles talks about is searching for cheesecake recipes and being able to pull a 300-year-old cheesecake recipe and make that for yourself. It's pretty cool, like just to be able to do that and look backwards in history to see how some of the dishes and things that we've made have evolved over time. And the fact that someone spent 50 years of her life gathering all of this stuff so that we would have this chance to dig backwards into the history of food, something that has been generally underappreciated for a long period of time. I mean, one of the fascinating things that the article talks about is how for many years this study of the history of food was underappreciated by academics and historians because it was seen as food and recipes in the kitchen was seen as sort of a woman's thing and not worthy of study. And over time, that finally shifted, and she was there for this sequence of time and to be part of that. And I just think that's such a cool backstory, but also an interesting resource right now. And yes, it's Wikipedia style. So if you happen to be one of those people who loves cooking and loves recipe books or has a recipe of your own that's been handed down through generations, like maybe you can add it to this repository, kind of a Wikipedia style repository. And that would be really cool. Like that would be kind of an awesome thing to do. Another big story this week that a lot of people have been thinking about is education. I mean, more students are either going back to school or being in school virtually. And so every week I find new stories that get me thinking about what's education going to look like. And this week there were two stories that really caught my attention. One was a contributed opinion piece from a middle school English teacher talking about how the modern situation right now, at least in the US, with schools being forced in some cases to reopen and teachers being forced to go into school, is going to cause even more qualified teachers to leave the profession. And that's already been happening in many cases because of lack of resources, lack of pay, lack of respect. I mean, all of the reasons that we often see, at least here in this country, around that. And that's going to get even worse. And that was just a sobering op-ed to read about. But another piece that got me thinking about sort of education and what's going to happen around education right now is a model through a company called Beagle Learning, which is a sort of flipped educational model where essentially instead of the typical courses and curriculum, they use a question-based method. So essentially, students are crafting a question that they want to answer, something that they want to learn about themselves, and then conducting their research around that topic and bringing that back to class and learning from one another. And it's a very different model, and they have a whole tool and platform around trying to do that. But for anybody who's thinking about teaching anything or trying to present anything or deliver that in a more interesting and immersive and non-boring way, uh, this technique may be one of the things that you can use. And I'm already thinking about how I might use that in some of the education and learning, virtual learning things that I'm doing to try and build that out and create more interesting content so that people can interact with it and learn in a different way. And I think that's something worth doing for all of us. This week, a lot of people have also been talking about just the anniversary of women earning the right to vote here in the US. And on 538, which is a research-based data blog, they did a deep analysis on how women have voted since they got the right to vote here in the US. And they have some pretty interesting statistics around that in terms of tendencies of women, what the issues were around why they vote certain ways, what the direction has been, how it's shifted over time. And probably the headline that they talked about in the article was up until 1980 specifically, there wasn't a big difference in how women and men voted. The lines were sort of parallel to one another. And since 1980, the shift has been much more dramatic in terms of the way women vote, the number of women who vote, and how different that is from the way that men vote. And the whole article has a bunch of different charts, a lot of different statistics and analysis. Really interesting to read if you're interested in this topic. If you're curious about the gender split when it comes to voting, how we tend to vote, highly recommend this article. All of the articles that I've talked about in this show are posted in the show notes on YouTube. So if you're watching this show and you want to link, if you want to click on any of those links, read any of the stories for yourself, you can always do that. You can get the full list of stories as a addendum to the show. So you can always dig into anything you see further and kind of read the whole thing. When it comes to traveling, there's consistently stories about how the world of travel has shifted. And one of the stories this week was about airports and specifically how the vision for airports may be impacted by what's happening right now over time. And if you think about kind of what airports were focused on 6 months ago, many of them were talking about making themselves destinations. I mean, in the case of Singapore's Changi Airport, like that was a destination that even people who weren't traveling would go to some degree because it was such a cool place to be. It was almost like a cross between a shopping mall and an amusement park and an airport. And that was the philosophy. And many of these airports were aiming to build new terminals with bigger things integrated into them because they wanted to be such central shopping and entertainment destinations. And then the pandemic hit and all of that really shifted. And one of the effects of that a lot of experts are thinking about and talking about is that these airports may become more utilitarian in nature. They may be more business centers. They may start focusing on travel itself, which some people think is a good thing because, I mean, that's what an airport should be. It should be focused on efficiently moving people through and having as seamless of an experience and as safe of an experience doing that as possible. But other people who kind of have been stuck in airports for a long period of time, maybe on layovers, or who were seeing this destination mentality and thinking, well, these are just really cool places to be. It's kind of a shame because there are some amazing experiences in some of these airports, and I've been to some of these airports. It seems like a long time ago now, but I've been to some of them where like you have these really really cool places to be where it doesn't bother you as much to be stuck there for several hours waiting for your next flight. And in fact, sometimes it doesn't feel like enough time. And that has sort of shifted, I think, because of the way that these airports have gone. So, final, last but not least story here is the non-obvious book of the week release. Every week I pick a new book that came out, and this book is called Money for Nothing. And the reason why you see two covers here is because one of the things that I wanted to spotlight is just how interesting it is that there are two different subtitles for this book, depending on whether you're looking at the book version that was released in the US or the original one that was released in the UK. The UK version, the subtitle is The South Sea Bubble and the Invention of Modern Capitalism. The US subtitle is The Scientists, Fraudsters, and Corrupt Politicians Who Reinvented Money, Panicked a Nation, and Made the World Rich. Really interesting how these subtitles are different just from a publishing perspective because of what might appeal to different audiences in the US versus in England and Europe. This book was fascinating because it does take that historical approach and looks at the role of money and how people have used money and investments to shift the culture. And that's what I found really interesting about this. It digs back a little bit into history. It's a good sort of tail end of summer read as well. It just recently was long listed for the FT Financial Times Book Award. So it's highly recognized already, even though it just came out. So I definitely recommend this book. And as a reminder, every week I find a new book that has been released that week or within the past few days. And I spotlight that on the show as a potential book that you might want to read. And this is one of those. So that is the final story that I have for you this week. I want to say thank you so much for reading my email newsletter every week, for joining me on this show, either live or recorded. It is available on YouTube. All the links will be available for the show as well. I hope you found this useful. I hope you enjoyed the stories this week. And remember, always, always stay non-obvious. I'll see you again next week, next Thursday, with another batch of brand new non-obvious stories. And until then, have an amazing rest of your week and weekend.